All right, we're here. Had a little technical difficulty this morning because the power went out, and sometimes it messes up the camera. And when that happens, we have to have Aaron work miracles, which he just did. Could you get them lights? And there's another one. There you go. Now I can see. All right. Like all the other commandments, do not give false witness against your neighbor is given within a specific context. The initial context of you shall not give false witness is that of a legal testimony of a witness in a public trial. The use of the word neighbor also suggests a trial that takes place within a community. So, for instance, in Leviticus 19:18, it says, "Do not seek revenge or bear grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." But as we have seen with all the other commandments so far, it is not limited to this context. In Luke chapter 10, for instance, when asked by an expert of the law, "Who is your neighbor?" Jesus answers with the parable of the Good Samaritan. What Jesus is saying in Luke is that all are your neighbors, everyone. And in the broader sense, therefore, the ninth commandment should be understood the same way. The United States is unique in the notion that a person is innocent until proven guilty. Much of the world does not automatically assume innocence. Even nowadays, we've got some of the European nations and Turkey and China and many, many other countries are among those that assume you're guilty until you prove your own innocence. Under this form of judicial code, it is up to you to prove that you are not guilty of what you are accused of doing. This was the form of justice system that Israel had been used to in ancient Egypt. Remember the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39. Joseph was thrown into prison on the testimony of one person, Potiphar's wife. And when he finally did get out of prison, it was only because he had done a favor for Pharaoh himself. And if you remember, the baker did not fare so well. Today, we often assume that modern scientific forensic evidence to be more compelling than eyewitness testimony. But that was not the case back in 1500 BC, when almost everything depended on the testimony of witnesses. Often, it came down to one person's word against another. And since many crimes in the ancient world were capital offenses, often the defendant's life depended on the witness's honesty. The words of a false witness could be fatal. This exactly is what happened in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The Salem witch trials began because two girls accused friends and neighbors of being witches. Both Abigail Williams, 11, and Betty Paris, 9, had been assumed themselves to be guilty of being witches. And one of the only ways that you could be spared at that time was to accuse someone else of being the same thing, of being a witch. So they did. This idea caught on fast, and soon the idea that there were witches was everywhere, and people died because of it, because of false witnesses. But God's system of justice is spelled out for Israel in the Old Testament. It was different, the way that God spelled it out. When a person was accused and put on trial, they appeared before a jury of elders, and there had to be more than one witness. Deuteronomy chapter 19. One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. The Pentateuch repeats this rule in several places. For instance, in Numbers chapter 35, it says, anyone who kills a person is to be put to death as a murderer only on the testimony of witnesses, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. One witness was not enough. Another safeguard that was built into the law stemmed from the fact that the accuser had to participate in the execution of a person that they had accused. We see in Deuteronomy chapter 17, the hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting the person to death, and then the hand of all the other people. You must purge the evil from among you. Jesus put it this way in John chapter 8 when he said, he who is without sin, cast the first stone. If you threw the first stone, knowing full well that the person you accused was innocent, then you were guilty of breaking the 6th commandment. Don't murder. So, if anyone found out what you had been doing, you'd go through and have that same thing done to you. Since there was quite a few people that were at this time, quite a few of the things during this Old Testament times that were execution style or had a lot of ramifications, like maybe cutting a thief's hand off and that sort of thing, you had to be real careful because that would happen to you. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 19, where it says, the judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving the false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness as the witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge the evil from among you. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. The purpose of this was to deter false testimony. And we see this next verse is in the same context where it says, show no pity, life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot. Too often, verse 21, this one in the red up there, is quoted out of context as a way to show how harsh God was in the Old Testament. But in its true context, an eye for an eye was used to deter false testimony. If you falsely accused someone of a crime and their punishment was going to be a loss of an eye, then your eye would be taken if you were found to be lying about what they had done. Zechariah 8, verse 16. Speak the truth to each other and render truth and sound judgment in your courts. In our present system, when giving testimony, we are reminded that we are under obligation to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But a courtroom is not the only place where someone can give false testimony. Remember our rules for interpretation of the Ten Commandments. One of these rules states that what is forbidden is the most extreme form of that particular sin. And as we've said before, murder was the worst kind of hatred. Adultery was the worst form of sexual sin. Murder and adultery are not the only things those commandments forbid. And similarly, the ninth commandment prohibits the deadliest lie, that of condemning an innocent, someone that is innocent of a crime they did not commit. But according to the rule of categories, each command applies to a whole host of lesser yet related sins of the same kind. And in this case, God is forbidding every form of falsehood in a in a very subtle way. Someone like Hosea from the Old Testament confirms this in chapter 4, where it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed." Hosea is clearly referring to the Ten Commandments when he makes these statements in these verses. But the Hebrew word that Hosea uses for lying is not the one that is used back here in Exodus in the Ten Commandments. He's using a more general word. Instead, Hosea used a word that means false testimony in general. It doesn't mean false testimony. It simply means to lie. The ninth commandment also deals with other forms of lying. If you look at a thesaurus, it gives a lot of synonyms for the word lie. I got just a few of them listed here: deceit, deception, dishonesty, disinformation, distortion, evasion, fabrication, falsehood, fiction, forgery. I mean, the list goes on and on. Fables, fibs, guile, tall stories, white lies. I will not ask in this room for a show of hands to see how many have broken this ninth commandment at some point in their lives, because I know we all have. But remember, once you have broken any one of the commandments of God from this Old Testament Ten Commandments, then you were guilty of breaking the whole law. Again, this shows us two things. One, just how difficult it was to keep the law of Moses, and two, how essential it was for Jesus to come and die on the cross so that we could have grace. Some of you are old enough to remember the TV show called Hee Haw, and I won't ask for a show of hands because I could just about pick you out. One of my favorite songs in that show was The Gossiping Ladies. And I'm not going to sing the whole thing, but you get the idea, for those of you who don't remember. Now, we're not ones to go around spreading rumors. No, we're not just the gossiping kind. Oh, you will never hear one of us repeating gossip, so you better be sure and listen close the first time. One of my favorite songs. It's cute. But most often, gossip contains a fair amount of misinformation. I'm sure that most of us have grown up hearing sermons about gossip. People who gossip trade in heresy, rumor, innuendo. We break the ninth commandment anytime that we tell a lie of any kind that causes harm to someone else. What the ninth commandment forbids is any sort of falsehood against our neighbor. Our capacity to speak was given to us by God for the express purpose of praising Him and blessing others. Like it says in James chapter 3, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. He does not, or he goes on in this verse later, in verse 8, to say that no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Words can be dangerous, and therefore, when the New Testament lists the sins we are supposed to avoid, it often tells us to watch closely what we say. For instance, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says that he is afraid that when he comes to the people in Corinth, of what he's going to find: discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambitions, slander, gossip. Those are included in those. Two of the things that he lists are part of the ninth commandment. At the end of Revelation, John is giving his closing arguments as to who is included in the Lamb's book of life and who is not. In Revelation chapter 22, starting in verse 14, he said, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter into the gates. Outside are the dogs, the sorcerers, the sexually immoral persons, the murderers, the idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices lying." It's included. Just as Moses did, John places lying alongside of adultery, murder, and bowing down to idols. Yet there is only one that lived on earth that never told a lie. And that's told in John chapter 1, verse 4, among many other places in the New Testament. It says that Jesus came from the Father, full of grace and truth. That tells us what God thinks, I believe, about the importance of the ninth commandment. Any questions on the ninth commandment before we move into our final commandment? Yes.
Is gossip always untrue, or is it just passing on information that isn't anybody else's business? Somebody tells you something.
You're older than I am. You should know the answer to that question. Should be telling me. You should be going, you shouldn't do that.
She wants to know if she's gossiping.
He thinks that you want to know if you're gossiping or not, and I don't. Bill, no. I don't gossip.
I don't want to gossip, but I think Julie knows the answer to that.
Did you hear what he said? Julia, did you hear him?
Well, there are some things that are not untrue. They just have no business being spread.
Well, there's other places in the New Testament talk specifically about gossip. Okay? So I don't think we have to rely just on the Ten Commandments to find out whether that's wrong or not. You probably have some of those verses memorized. I don't remember any off the top of my head. Okay?
Well, I'll have to look that up and study on that. If it's wrong, I know we'll be guilty of it.
Listen, we probably already are, all of us. All right, commandment number 10. Jesus made many statements that are in direct opposition to cultural norms, both past and present. For instance, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." That doesn't seem logical to most people living today. Or in Luke chapter 6, where he says, "Love your enemies and do good to those that hate you." Such sayings stand directly at odds with the way most of the world thinks and acts today. But in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, when asked by a person in the crowd to determine or to demand their brother divide the inheritance, Jesus makes the following statement. He says, "Watch out, beware of covetousness and all kinds of greed, for a man's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Following this, he told the parable of the rich fool. Not only was this statement foreign to the ears of the people that lived in Palestine 2,000 years ago, it is in direct opposition to the consumer culture all around us today. We are constantly buying things we do not need with money we do not have, while at the same time never being truly satisfied with what we just bought. Yet, advertisers still convince us that no interest for one full year will make shopping at our local superstore or online or loading our online shopping cart a satisfying experience. So our credit card debt goes up and our disposable income goes down, and our new motto becomes crave and spend, for the kingdom of stuff is at hand. Then, rather than being satisfied with our new and latest and greatest, we instead are lured into believing that we need the next latest and greatest. And all the while, our basements, our garages, and our pole barns get fuller and fuller and fuller until we have to build bigger barns. Exodus chapter 20. "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." The Hebrew word for covet brings with it the meanings greatly beloved, delectable thing, great delight, desire, lust, precious thing. And its base meaning, or at its base meaning, to covet is to crave or to yearn for something that belongs to someone else, or specifically doesn't belong to you. We covet anything we set our hearts on. Anytime we set our hearts on something that is not rightfully ours. And it is not simply wanting something that we do not have. It is the insatiable desire of getting things that the world has to offer instead of desiring the spiritual things that God has to offer. If you think about it, breaking the 10th commandment was a large part of the first sin ever committed. God had given Adam and Eve everything that they could ever need. The first 2 chapters of Genesis make it a point to telling that everything that God had provided was very good. Plenty of everything: gold, precious stones, water, food. And only one restriction: don't eat of this one tree. Then, in Genesis chapter 3, the first salesman, in the form of the serpent, told Eve that she needed just one more thing. And it was in this way, it was in no way vital to her survival, and that she really didn't need it. But the salesman, the serpent, said, he enticed her to envy by telling her that if she ate, things would get better. She would be like God. So Eve took the fruit and she ate it, and she gave it to Adam in order to gain something which she was never intended to have. And of course, the rest is his history. We have been coveting stuff we do not have ever since. What the 10th commandment forbids is this kind of desire. We can see this tendency at an early age when a small child wants a toy that belongs to or is played with by another child. We tell them to find another toy or to try this idea of sharing the toy. Yet, as we get older, the manner in which we covet becomes more subtle. In James chapter 4, it says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't They come from your desires that battle within you. You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. Usually, we associate thou shalt not covet with material things. The 10th commandment mentions various forms of property, houses, servants, livestock, etc. But today, most people are just not that into donkeys and oxen. Unlike when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, we have an endless array of faster cars, classy new clothes, captivating entertainment, appealing appliances, and gadgets galore. Consumerism seems to be what our whole society is built on. No matter what we have, we always seem to want something else. Ralph Waldo Emerson said the following: "Things are in the saddle and ride mankind." But what we call chasing the dream often becomes what the Bible calls coveting. The list given in Exodus is not to be considered exhaustive. In fact, there's a phrase at the very end in red here, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. In other words, anything else, not just donkeys and servants and wives and etc. Anything. We're forbidden to covet anything at all. Coveting other people's attributes is wrong, such as coveting someone's age, looks, brains, talent. Coveting the situation or status that others are in is also forbidden. God's law rules out every kind of unlawful desire. Of course, not all desires are selfish. Not all desires are wrong. Our desire for food reminds us to eat. Our desire to do something is helpful in motivating us to work. Our desire to have friends draws us into community. Our desire to know where we came from and where we are going should motivate us to search for answers that lead us to God. But our desires have been corrupted by sin, and therefore we all too often want the wrong things in the wrong way at the wrong time for the wrong reason. Being discontent with our present state all too often is the motivating factor that leads us to covet. So we believe that the grass is greener on the other side, when really it is only greener on top of the septic tank. Genesis chapter 3. If we remember from our study in Genesis that Eve saw what she thought was good and she took. And today we are doing exactly the same thing. We look at the 10 Commandments and might think that murder, stealing, and adultery were the biggest problems and the biggest sins that we should not partake in. And compared to these big sins, wanting stuff isn't really that big of a deal. But sinful deeds always start with sinful desires. Cain wanted his sacrifice to be accepted like his brothers. The covetous desire grew until, in the end, he was wanted for murder. Achan stole treasure from Jericho. In Joshua chapter 7, it says, "When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold, I coveted them and I took them." David coveted his friend's wife and then murdered his friend, or had him murdered. And Ananias and Sapphira coveted a particular standing in the community, so they lied about their gift to the poor. Coveting is not a standalone sin. It is often coupled with breaking one or more of the other commands. James chapter 1, starting in verse 14. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and hurtful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced their hearts with much grief. Ken and I were talking last week for a minute, a little bit along this lines, about having stuff and what was wrong and that sort of thing. And I mentioned to him that I never considered myself rich until I got older and I had stuff, and I looked around, there were people that didn't have stuff. And Ken says, I never considered myself rich because I had a house until someone told me I don't have a house. Being rich is relative, guys, okay? We're always richer than somebody, most everybody. There is something about the 10th commandment that distinguishes it from the rest of the Decalogue. The other 9 begin by explicitly condemning some kind of outward action. Don't make idols. Don't unlawfully kill. Don't take what belongs to someone else. But the 10th commandment goes straight to the heart. Yes, as we have discussed, our desires for control leads to idols, hatred leads to murder, unchecked desire leads to stealing. According to our inside-outside rule, each commandment governs inward attitudes as well as outward actions. But the first 9 commandments in this list start with the outside and then work their way inward. What is different about the 10th commandment, do not covet, is that it begins on the inside. Do not covet is not so much concerned with what we do, it is concerned with what we want to do. It governs our internal desires. As a result, we might ask, why then do we need the 10th commandment? Isn't it already included in the other 9? If God's law against stealing also condemns our greedy hearts as well as our thieving hands, then why do we need the 10th commandment? And the answer is that the 10th commandment makes explicit what the other commandments only imply. Command number 10 shows us for certain that God requires inward submission and not simply outward obedience. Like the Egyptian ceremony of the dead that we discussed quite a while ago when we were in that part of Exodus, it proves that it is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob which truly judges the heart. And it shows that God's true law is spiritual and not simply physical. Theologian Michael Horton tells of a Jewish rabbi that told him the difference between Judaism and Christianity. The guy says, we, talking about the Jewish people or Judaism, believe that you have to actually commit the physical act before it's really sin. Otherwise, we'd be sinning all the time. If you haven't got it out of this class so far, up to this point, that's true. We're sinning all the time. Sometimes we don't even realize it because it's so subtle. And that's what the 10 Commandments is really trying to tell us, just how horrible we really are as people. And thou shalt not covet is the one that points directly to the heart and tells us that all the other ones are not just outward. This is the crux of the matter. If God judges us for what is on the inside as well as what is on the outside, then we are all sinning all the time. That is what Jesus was trying to tell those that listened to the Sermon on the Mount. And that is what the 10th commandment is intended to teach. Martin Luther said, this last commandment, then, talking about the 10th commandment, is addressed not to those whom the world considers wicked rogues, but precisely to the most upright, to people who wish to be commended as honest and virtuous because they have not offended against the preceding commandments. Think about that. Therefore, it is the 10th commandment, more than any other, that convinces us we are sinners and shows the need for a gracious God. It seems that it is also the 10th commandment that had the same kind of effect on the Apostle Paul. When we go to Romans chapter 7, I would not have come to know sin except through the law, for I would not have known about coveting if the law did not say, you shall not covet. But sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. Paul says that he was a good Jewish person. We know from other places that he kept the law. He didn't steal. He didn't murder. He didn't do any of these other things. He kept the law as best he could, at least inwardly. But Paul's implication here is that it is the 10th commandment that, when understood correctly, that exposes sin. Francis Schaeffer was a man ahead of his time when it came to understanding how society influences religion. And if you've never read of any of Francis Schaeffer's books, it's worth putting in the effort. Francis Schaeffer said this, "Thou shalt not covet is the internal commandment which shows the man who thinks himself to be moral that he really needs a savior. Like Paul, suddenly, when he is confronted with the inward commandment, don't covet, he is brought to his knees." When asked, most everyone here would agree that God gives us what we need. And if we needed more or less to enable us to glorify God, then he would make an adjustment that would suit his purpose. But unfortunately, in practice, we do not always act like we are truly in agreement with that statement. We're running short on time. We'll get down to the end here. So, the way to get rid of covetous desire is to be completely satisfied with God and what he provided. Even Paul had to learn this. In Philippians, that's what I just had up there. In Philippians chapter 4, he says, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret. He had to learn this. He learned the secret of being content in every situation, any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. God says loudly in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament, trust me. Just like he showed Israel in Exodus when he let them out of Egypt and provided them with the impossible in the wilderness. Trust me, I will provide. And Jesus goes on in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 6 and says, seek ye first the kingdom of righteousness, and all of these other things will be added unto you. Sometimes we sing the words to that song, but do we believe it? Any questions? Comments? Yes. Absolutely. I look around here, and not everybody was in the first class. This is the last one, all right? Next week, Terry's going to teach for a while before I come back again. And if you have not listened to the first ones, especially the first 3 of this lesson, they're online, they're recorded. Please do so. Because what I'm hoping to show, I mean, Tom brought up another verse. I think everybody in here could bring up verses just on coveting or any of the other commandments that are in the New Testament or in other places in the Old Testament that deal with that. What I've tried to show, at least throughout this and especially in the first few of these lessons, is how these ideas of how we should live have been permeated by God from the very beginning. And we can find lots and lots and lots of examples, both in the Bible and outside the Bible, that show that. Too often we look at the Ten Commandments as something that was simply given to Israel for the very first time and never given before. Well, that list may not have been given, but those principles have been around ever since God created Adam and Eve. Anything else? Thanks.